Hello, this is Sue McKenna. In this presentation, I am going to talk through the ways in which we might want to classify various people researching higher education. And I should begin with two big caveats. The first is that I put my text from this into generative AI to produce my slides, and they are exceedingly boring slides. And if I had had more time, I would have made them look prettier, but this is where we are. The second caveat is that I am basing this largely on the kind of literature with which I am familiar. I've either used it myself or I've critiqued it, and so inevitably there will be gaps and blind spots, and there are probably all sorts of theorists that you will think about or theoretical positions that you may be drawing on that I've omitted entirely, and I'd love to hear from you about those gaps and blind spots. But also, even if you recognize all of the names on the slides that are going to follow and you're very familiar with all of them and you can't see any blind spots or gaps, you might think that you would have grouped them together differently, and I think that's very possible. So I've kind of put them together according to what I think works in terms of coming to understand the landscape of these different frameworks. And I think one of the things you'll notice as I go through them is that there are a number of positions that are contradictory, they are incompatible. So while some of these overlap a lot, some of my categories are ideologically compatible and perhaps even a little bit repetitive, you will see that some are really quite contradictory. And that is why you need to be able to make a decision, and this presentation will hopefully help you to make that decision, either about the theoretical framing that you are standing in. It'll hopefully help you to identify the theoretical framings that underpin some of the text you're reading, because not everyone will name it explicitly or identify their ideological positioning explicitly. And I'm hoping that it will help in that process. In order to categorize them, I basically asked three questions, and I think that it's useful perhaps for you to think about these questions whenever you are trying to explain to your reader why you've taken a particular position that you've taken, or when you're trying to assess what position others have taken. The first question is, who is the university for? And I don't just mean, the students who study in it or the researchers who get paid salaries by it. I mean, who does it serve? Does it serve the individual? Does it serve the state, the government, society? Does it serve the market, industry, the economy? Does it serve communities, groups of people? And does it serve the future? Because arguably, in terms of that last one, a lot of our knowledge is designed to destroy rather than serve the future. But that's a discussion for another day. The second cross-cutting question that I'd like to recommend you ask is, what counts as knowledge in this particular theoretical framework? Is it about different disciplines with their own norms, values, methods? Is it important that knowledge is applied? It has to be applicable for helping people in the planet, or helping industry, or helping the economy? Or is knowledge valued for its own sake because it helps us understand the world better? Does knowledge have to be recognized in the academy over centuries from a particular global northwestern tradition, or do different indigenous forms of knowledge count as knowledge too? Is knowledge valued because it is generalizable and universal, or is it valued when it is local and only helps us to understand a very particular localized phenomenon or context? And then a new question I've been asking myself is AI-generated knowledge? If it is producing new models, new formulas, new understandings of the world, how does that sit alongside other forms of knowledge? So what counts as knowledge? And then the third cross-cutting question that I think is useful to ask is really about who decides the answers to the first two questions. Who gets to determine what the university is for and what should count as knowledge? Is it the academics? Is it governments? Is it funders? Is it ranking agencies? Is it students? Is it employers? Before we get started with the various groupings that I'm going to go through, I think there's 8 that I'm going to go through, it might be useful to have a look at this Cartesian plane that I've got here. Of course, like all Cartesian planes, it's a little bit reductive because everything's far more nuanced and than simply 4 quadrants. But I thought it might be quite fun to reflect on your own understandings in regards to this Cartesian plane, and perhaps you'd like to pause the video to think through where you sit. Like all Cartesian planes, it's got 2 axes, the vertical and the horizontal. The vertical, I've suggested, is transformative and reproductive. So transformative is any kind of theory about higher education as being about change, as being about critical questions around status quo, as being about the desire for things to be better. And on the other end of that continuum, reproductive, the idea that the university is reproduces the status quo, makes society, it should make society, provide society what it needs in terms of knowledge, that it doesn't need to change things, it just needs to do things more efficiently and better. And then on the horizontal continuum, we've got individual to structural. So individual on the left-hand side there is the focus on the individual student experience, on on what the staff member experiences, or what they get benefit from, or what constrains them, what various individuals have as a relationship to higher education, versus structural, which is looking at how do the big systems, the big social structures shape, condition, empower, disempower, include, exclude. Now, as I say, of course, there's no study that is only reproductive or transformative. There's no theoretical position that's only individual or structural. But it might be useful to kind of think where your theory fits in. And you might like to return to this slide later and think about the various groupings that I'm going to present to you now, and think about where each of those would fit in on this Cartesian plane. Before I do, I think it's important to note that I don't think higher education has ever had a golden age, and we need to be very careful when we talk about what's wrong with the status quo, what we want to change, what is unfair and unjust, that we don't ever allow our readers to think that we are harking back to some much better time, because that much better time did not exist. Universities have had a generally problematic history. They have, over the first 3/4, 5/8 of their lifespan, served a particular role in maintaining social divisions, using a very close relationship to the state and to the church to control societies. But here you have on the slide a very crude overview. If you start at the bottom left, the Bologna University, Italy, 1088, the focus there is very much on preparing a professional elite. Most histories of universities actually start with 1088, but as you can see, if you look higher up, on that left-hand side, there were a great many universities in Africa before that, and many of those really focused on philosophy, on astronomy, on theology, and then we moved into the Bologna, and then we got the Humboldt's University, which is the first time we really saw an explicit bringing together of teaching and research in the university, and the notion that universities should have academic freedom. They should be free from the church and from the state. And then we've got Newman's idea of the university in 1852, which really was the idea that a university should be for nurturing critical citizens, intellectuals who can participate in society's conversations about itself. From the 1960s onwards, after World War II, there was a huge massification of higher education around the world, emergence of a great many new universities, with the idea that universities are important for economic growth, that they provide human capital, skilled labor, necessary for national development. and therefore should be open to all people and are an important vehicle for social mobility. And then more recently, from the 1990s onwards, we've had this neoliberal turn where universities have increasingly been managed like businesses. And so we see the marketization of institutional processes. We see increased managerialism, making sure that all the workers within the university are efficient. We see the commodification of research. We see the use of rankings and global competition to measure universities against each other. Right, so let me go through my 8 major theoretical frameworks. For each of these, there's a lot of text on each slide. I'm only going to go through a few of the key points. You can return to the slides or come back to or pause on them to make sense of the text if you'd like to do so. So let's start with the classical liberal education theory, which I mentioned earlier when I spoke about Newman's, the idea of the university. He has this idea of universities really being about nourishing the moral character, ensuring that we develop people who are critical, who are challenging. They should be exposed to a range of ways of thinking. They should have exposure to not just one narrow specialist discipline, but to a variety of ways of thinking and being. And there's a real understanding that there is epistemic value within knowledge. And this is about humility, care, rigor, curiosity, open inquiry. Okay, moving along. Human capital theory. So human capital theory is really focused from the 1960s onwards on this idea that university should give you rewards for investment. It should ensure individual productivity, social mobility, but also national growth. So it's all about ensuring skills and credentials, and a lot of industry and even state funding into higher education under this theory was the idea that it would provide returns on investment at the industry or a national economy level. And this language remains very dominant in most government higher education policy discourses, even in the more recent South African higher education policy discourses, which is a significant shift away from our early 1997 white paper. The more recent ones, we hear much more of this language. And it's very dominant in documents from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and so on. What's important to note, I'm interrupt myself quickly to say, what's important to note is as you're reading texts and you're trying to identify what kind of theoretical school they belong to, they will often not name their theory explicitly. They might talk about human capital, but they might not. So you have to kind of figure out the value systems, and that's where those questions on the right-hand side, who is it for, what counts as knowledge, and who decides, is particularly useful to try and identify the theoretical framing. Right, moving along. Critical theory and social justice perspectives. I like to think that this is my theoretical home, and it really sees universities as sites of struggle and as potentially being sites of transformation. It argues very critically that many universities do not perform this role, that they are in fact very much reproducers of social inequalities, and that they are very much implicated in environmental degradation, but it holds on to the genuine hope that they could be spaces of freedom, of liberation, of the kind of critical thinking that will enable us to take responsibility for each other. And in this kind of theory, there's a sense that pedagogy should be emancipatory, and it shouldn't just lead us all to be domesticated, compliant subjects. Right, moving along. Post-colonial and decolonial theories have got a lot of overlap with the kinds of critical theories, social justice theories that I've just mentioned. Some would even collapse them, but I think it's worth looking at them a bit differently, because the primary agenda, I think, of the post-colonial theorists is really to interrogate the extent to which the knowledges that we validate, that we legitimate in our universities are narrow, exclusionary, and represent a particular colonial past, and that in doing so we have narrowed our understandings of the world. We have, because of the colonial epistemologies, languages, and hierarchies, we have not actually been able to make the most of what a pluriversal understanding of knowledge would allow for us. It's about challenging all those who have an understanding of knowledge that is purely from a Western canon, and that perhaps fail to see how other knowledges might allow us to make better sense of the world. So it's not about adding these other knowledges, it's really about bringing them into conversation, and sometimes perhaps direct argument and debate with the hegemonic knowledges. And so there's a real sense that decolonial scholars are calling for a bit of epistemic disobedience, right from how we make sense of the world down to our weird little norms and practices on campus. Right, moving along. Capabilities approach. This focuses very much on what people can do and who they can be, and the idea that education should really expand our freedoms. So instead of just looking at economic output, it looks at human capabilities and flourishing. It certainly argues that in a world where there is education for human capability, development, and flourishing, there will be economic benefits at a national individual level, but its focuses on those functionings, what people are able to achieve from our freedoms, from our capabilities. And so it's not just about getting the qualification, it's about being able to have dignity, to nurture agency, to have power to speak in the world. Right, moving along. Sociology of knowledge. This is a slightly different kind of theoretical framework because it focuses very much on the nature of the knowledge itself, and therefore the curriculum, what's included, excluded, who teaches, how they teach, what gets taught, what are students expected to do, how is it assessed, and in fact many of those working in the sociology of knowledge argue that many of the other theoretical frameworks I've mentioned thus far suffer from what's known as knowledge blindness. So they very much focus on issues of power and justice and social relations in the university, but they fail to look at the actual content that is being taught and how that is created and how that is transmitted and reproduced and so on, with the idea that knowledge itself has structure and physics is a different structure to philosophy, and that has fundamental implications for what gets taught, how it gets assessed, and so on. And probably the key theorist here is Bernstein, who has helped us to understand these different knowledge structures, and who really, like many others in sociology of knowledge theoretical framing, argue that knowledge can be powerful if it is principled, if it allows us to understand the world, if it allows us to make sense of problems not yet imagined, if it allows us to participate fully in the world, then it is powerful. And so access to this power is a social justice issue. We've also got legitimation code theory, which was developed by Mayton, building on the work of Bernstein and Bourdieu, and he contributes the ways in which these knowledge claims vary very much across different fields and contexts, but has also given us tools to understand how the knower, the ideal knower within different fields, is expected to be, to act, to think, even to dress and talk in particular ways because of what is legitimated in that field. Somewhat controversially, I have put critical realism in here, Margaret Archer, because critical realism is a meta theory. It explains the world, and Bhaskar, who's one of the key theorists in critical realism, really provides a theory that helps us to understand how the world in general works, from the physical environment to the social environment and so on. Archer hones in on the social environment, society, how people interact, how we make our way in the world. And so their theories are not about knowledge and education per se, but because they've been used so much by higher education researchers, and because they really do allow us to understand aspects of sociology of knowledge, I have put them in here. Archer sort of really argues that we need to, if we are to understand any social phenomenon, including curriculum, including a classroom, including assessment, including the student experience, if we are to understand any social phenomenon, we need to be able to distinguish between agency, the actions of individuals and the extent to which individuals have freedom to act on their own personal projects, and how that agency interacts with, is shaped by, is constrained by, is enabled by large social structures and sort of cultural norms and values. So it really acknowledges that we do have power in the world. We are not just little robots at the whim of big social structures and culture, but we also are not gods. We are not free to do whatever we want to. We are shaped by the world around us. And if we are to understand anything, we need to understand that interplay. So their focus of this people working in sociology of knowledge is really looking at how curricula can empower, but how it can also simply reproduce social hierarchies. And then more recently, there's a field looking at what's known as the neoliberal critique, that's looking at the way in which universities are increasingly shaped by market logic. And they, researchers in this field, really argue that the market logic has colonized the academic project. So increasingly the university itself is a market actor, just as any other industry might be, and it competes for students and rankings and fundings. And so we commodify all the things that we produce, and it has a number of parasitic industries, as I have called them, and how those parasitic industries, like all good parasites, they need to keep their host alive, but they thrive off the back of our blood. Sorry, you can hear my view on this one. And so in this world of academic capitalism, academics are not seen as intellectuals, they are seen as workers who need to be managed for efficiency. And so we have management, we have a real valorizing of procedures, and we have audit culture rather than academic judgment. Right, and the 8th of the 8 frameworks is this sort of, I wasn't quite sure how to put this one, but triple helix. Triple helix is the idea that universities, government, and industry are rely on each other and function together for better or worse, and that the way in which in this hyper-capitalist world that innovation and progress happens is through the interaction between universities, the state, and the market. And so we need to understand that relationship. And the focus here is very much on universities' role in terms of knowledge transfer, patents, spin-offs, and so on. Very focused on applied knowledge, transdisciplinary knowledge, problem solving. And we see this a lot in our policies, both in higher education and in the DSI policies. Moving along. Okay, so those are the 8 dominant frameworks as I kind of make sense of them. But then there are 3 kind of additional frameworks that I tried to squash into the previous 8, but in the end decided to leave on their own. And so I'm going to quickly look at those. Moving along. The issue of epistemic justice, and it could easily have fitted in the social critical one, in the decolonial one, even the capabilities one. I wasn't exactly sure where to put it in. But really this is about the idea that if knowledge is powerful, who gets it? Who counts as a knower? Miranda Fricker talking about testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, really asking about how can we make sense of social justice if we don't make sense of what knowledge counts, what knowledge doesn't count, whose knowledge counts, who gets to access knowledge, and so on. Moving along. Then we've got complexity, ecological and ontological approaches. And this is more kind of systems theory, I think. And this is really, I think maybe it's called futures thinking, some would call it. And this is really this idea that universities are constantly adapting, and that any attempt to pin down their meaning or to plan for their future is going to fall apart if you don't have ecological thinking, if you don't understand the extent to which universities both replicate and shape the environment around them. And so there's a real focus here on the future, on the extent to which universities do prepare the kinds of people who can think beyond the here and now, the immediate sort of industry problems or social problems. And then, of course, we've got artificial intelligence. And, this is the question that I asked at the beginning, I think, of is generative AI knowledge? And I'm not just talking about large language models producing texts, or producing PowerPoints. I'm talking here about producing new understandings, new formula, new models. Is that knowledge? And what does that mean for knowledge, for science, for society's skepticism of universities? Is that not going to be exacerbated thanks to generative AI? Is it going to cause problems with a mass of algorithmic bias where everybody has the same banal, Western-focused interpretation of the world? Because we know that generative AI has enormous algorithmic biases in terms of what it focuses on and what it produces. And I think you'll see I've got more key scholars for this slide than for any of the others, because this is where most of my reading is happening at the moment. And I'm really enjoying it, even though it's a little bit like reading a post-apocalyptic novel, so it's all rather terrifying. Okay, so what I'm thinking that might be useful for you to do is to think about the framework that most echoed with your own ideological positions, your own values. Was it one of them that's listed? Perhaps it's not listed. Which, is how is it going to be useful for your research? Are there any here that would be very problematic? And maybe you read about your topic in the literature and it feels off, it feels uncomfortable. Is it because that author, that researcher is drawing on a particular theoretical framing? I'd like you to think about tensions that might have become obvious between these different frameworks. Did you notice that some were incompatible? And is there a particular researcher that you are drawing on that is not mentioned? And because I obviously only mentioned a few for each one, but perhaps you'd like to think about who you're drawing on. I think it's important to note that higher education studies, the field in which you are all now working, has enormous legitimacy problems. It is interdisciplinary, but it is contested. So higher education, you already have noticed, we draw from sociology, economics, philosophy, psychology. What counts as truth? We don't all talk the same language because we're borrowing from so many different fields. We're often using terminology in problematic ways, or we're speaking past each other. The field definitely is very northern dominant. Most higher education scholars that I have cited over the years come from the global north, and it is only really in very recent years that I am being exposed to other ways of thinking and understanding, and am forcing myself perhaps a little bit out of my comfort zone to engage, but this is not common in most other literature. A lot of higher education research is very applied and not at all theoretical. And I think particularly here of the subtle scholarship of teaching and learning, a lot of that research really has no theory at all. It just is what we rather crudely call show and tell. People put in a few quotes from bits of literature and then they tell us what they did in their classroom, and they're not really building any fundamental understandings, any of what we talked about earlier as powerful principled knowledge that can help us understand the world more broadly. And so these subtle studies often, please don't get me wrong, not all of them, but they often sit in the context of that particular author's study, and they don't, through describing that context, help us to understand the phenomenon more broadly. They stick in the context and they fail to lift it to the level of the phenomenon. There's a kind of a tension between subtle research and more theoretically ambitious research scholarship. And by the way, there is some theoretically ambitious subtle scholarship, don't get me wrong. I just don't think that dominates. And then I think that there are a number of theorists building really powerful global theory from a global south perspective. And I think that this is a real frontier that all of you are working in. This is my last slide. Just to sum up, theoretical positioning is not a box to tick. It's not like, this is what my supervisor said I must do, or this is the box I'm going to jump into and do my study from. It really is a responsibility. Because every research choice is theoretically loaded. So as you develop your research question, you choose what data you're going to collect, you choose how you're going to analyze it, to choose who you're going to include, who you're going to exclude. All of these choices come from a particular view of what higher education is for and how it should work. And so these theoretical assumptions are ideological. And I think that if you are able to articulate this in your work, if you're able to explain to your reader what position you take on these issues and why you take them, it's a real sign of scholarly rigor. I think that there is benefit in conflict. If we put different frameworks together, we can see how they rub up against each other and how they might show the shortcomings in each. But I think you need to be very careful of how you bring them together. You need to be very explicit about where there are tensions between them. And I think that it would be perhaps impossible to apply two different theoretical frameworks that have fundamentally different understandings of the purposes of higher education. I think you will get yourself in trouble if you try and use two sets of lenses that really believe higher education serves opposing purposes. So think carefully about what you're bringing together. I think we do have a responsibility as African higher education researchers, especially given the dominance of the global north. We need to think about who we're reading, who we're citing. We need to think about, are we serving our universities? Are we helping our systems? And are we informing global north systems perhaps of their own blind spots? Or are we simply serving a very global north extractive academic process? And I think it's really cool that we work in a field that is unsettled and that there are opportunities for so many new voices and new ways of thinking. And that means that your research can genuinely contribute to the theoretical debate. It's not just about filling a gap. It really is about helping us all to think better. Thank you.